Welcome. Before delving into the story of this vast land, let us first imagine. Imagine a continent bordered by the tumultuous Atlantic Ocean to the east and the boundless Pacific Ocean to the west, touching the frigid ice fields to the north and reaching the warm gulfs to the south. Thousands of years ago, as ancient civilizations rose and fell in other corners of the world, this place was already home to numerous unique cultures and peoples. They lived in harmony with nature, creating diverse social forms. Then, sails brought visitors from afar, and the gears of destiny began to turn rapidly. Conflict, fusion, conquest, resistance, hope, disappointment, ideals, reality, the cry for freedom, and the weight of chains intertwined and played out across this land. This is a story of dreams, struggles, contradictions, and constant reshaping. The journey of a nation that emerged from nothing, grew from small beginnings, and ultimately profoundly influenced the entire world. This is the story of America, a complex, magnificent, and still unfolding epic. Now, let us travel through time together, starting from the very beginning, to explore the grand and turbulent historical tapestry of the United States of America. Chapter 1. The First Inhabitants and European Encounters, Antiquity to 1607. Long before the so-called New World was discovered by Europeans, this land was already teeming with life. Tens of thousands of years ago, during the Ice Age, sea levels dropped, exposing the Bering Land Bridge connecting Asia and North America. Following large game, ancient hunter-gatherer groups, the ancestors of today's Native Americans, crossed onto this continent in waves. As glaciers melted and sea levels rose, they became isolated from the Asian continent, independently developing rich and diverse cultures. They were not a single people, but hundreds of tribes and nations with different languages, beliefs, social structures, and ways of life. From the Inuit and Aleut peoples of the Arctic regions, masters of their icy world, to the tribes of the Northwest Coast who skillfully utilized abundant marine resources, building massive wooden houses and carving intricate totem poles. From the groups in the warm climes of California who live by gathering acorns, fishing, and hunting, to the nomadic tribes of the Great Basin adapting to arid environments. From the Pueblo peoples in the arid Southwest who developed irrigation agriculture and built stunning cliff dwellings and adobe structures, to the vast Great Plains, initially traversed on foot, where tribes like the Sioux and Cheyenne later developed a unique buffalo hunting culture after the introduction of horses by Europeans. And in the eastern woodlands, home to societies combining agriculture, hunting, fishing, and gathering, forming complex political alliances like the Iroquois Confederacy with its sophisticated matrilineal system and longhouse council governance. These Native American societies were not static. They developed agriculture, cultivating vital crops like corn, maize, beans, and squash, which would later transform global diets. They possessed their own knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and medicine, and created unique artistic, musical, and oral literary traditions. For instance, the Mississippi River Valley once hosted the flourishing mound builder cultures, such as Cahokia, which was at one point the largest urban center in North America, featuring enormous earthen pyramids and a complex social hierarchy. In Mesoamerica and South America, the Maya, Aztec, and Inca empires built even more spectacular civilizations. While North American societies were generally more decentralized, they were equally vibrant and creative. They held a deep understanding and reverence for the land, viewing all of nature as imbued with spirit, and their relationship with the natural world was one of coexistence, not conquest. However, conflict and warfare also existed among Native American groups, as elsewhere in the world. Disputes over territory and resources occurred, but their worldview and patterns of warfare differed fundamentally from those of the arriving Europeans. Around 1000 AD, Viking explorers from Scandinavia, such as Leif Erikson, may have established short-lived settlements in present-day Newfoundland, Canada. However, this contact did not have a lasting impact on the course of history and was soon forgotten. What truly changed the destiny of this continent was the European age of exploration that began in the late 15th century. In 1492, sponsored by the Spanish monarchy, the Italian navigator Christopher Columbus sailed west, seeking a new route to Asia. He landed unexpectedly in the Bahamas, mistakenly believing he had reached the Indies. He thus called the local inhabitants Indians, a misnomer that persists to this day. Columbus's discovery was not a true discovery, as the land was already inhabited, but marked the beginning of sustained, large-scale contact between Europe and the Americas and the tremendous upheaval that followed, the Columbian Exchange. This exchange was two-way, but its impact was profoundly unequal. Europeans brought horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, wheat, sugarcane, coffee, and various diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza to the Americas. For native peoples with no prior exposure or immunity, these diseases were devastating. It is estimated that in the centuries following European arrival, as much as 90% or even more of the indigenous population perished from disease, warfare, and forced displacement. This was a heartbreaking demographic collapse, leading to the decline or disappearance of countless cultures and societies. Simultaneously, American crops like corn, potatoes, tomatoes, chili peppers, cocoa, and tobacco were taken back to Europe, Asia, and Africa, greatly enriching Old World diets, contributing to population growth, and profoundly changing global agriculture and cuisine. The introduction of the horse revolutionized the lives of Plains Indians, transforming them into highly efficient mounted hunters. Following Spain, other European powers like Portugal, France, the Netherlands, and England also joined the exploration and colonization of the Americas. Their motives were complex and varied, including the pursuit of wealth, gold, silver, furs, land, the spread of Christianity, God, gold, and glory, the establishment of overseas empires, and finding outlets for surplus domestic populations. The Spanish were the first to establish vast colonial empires in Central and South America and the North American Southwest. They conquered the Aztec and Inca empires, mined precious metals, and established plantations and missions. They left a deep imprint in areas like present-day Florida. St. Augustine, founded in 1565, is the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in the U.S. and New Mexico. The French focused primarily on northeastern North America, along the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, and the Mississippi River Valley. They were more centered on the fur trade and established relatively amicable commercial relationships with many Native American tribes, though they also became involved in intertribal conflicts. Quebec, founded in 1608, became the center of their colonial activities. The Dutch established the New Netherland colony in the Hudson River Valley, with New Amsterdam, later New York City, as its hub. They excelled in commerce and trade, attracting a diverse group of immigrants. However, it was the English who ultimately came to dominate the colonization of the North American East Coast. After early failed attempts, like the lost colony of Roanoke, the English successfully established their first permanent settlement at Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607. Funded by the Virginia Company of London, a joint stock company. The early years were fraught with hardship, starvation, disease, and conflict with the local Powhatan Confederacy. The stern leadership of figures like John Smith and the rise of tobacco cultivation, introduced by John Rolfe, eventually ensured the colony's survival. Tobacco became Virginia's economic backbone, but also created immense demand for land and labor, paving the way for the later large-scale importation of indentured servants and African slaves. In 1620, a group of English Puritan separatists, known as the Pilgrims, seeking religious freedom, arrived aboard the Mayflower in present-day Massachusetts and established Plymouth Colony. While on board, they signed the Mayflower Compact, considered an early expression of the American spirit of self-governance, establishing the principle of majority rule. With help from the local Wampanoag tribe, including Squanto, they survived their first harsh winter and held a feast with the Native Americans, considered the first Thanksgiving. However, this relatively peaceful relationship did not last. Subsequently, larger waves of Puritan immigrants arrived in the Massachusetts Bay Area, founding towns like Boston. They aimed to build a city upon a hill, a model society based on biblical principles. These early New England colonies were centered on religious faith, had tight-knit social structures, valued education. Harvard College, founded in 1636, and developed an economy based on family farms, fishing, shipbuilding, and trade. Thus, in the early 17th century on the North American East Coast, colonial outposts of different European nations began to take root. They brought their distinct cultures, institutions, and goals, engaging in complex and profound interactions with the indigenous societies already present on the land. Conflict and cooperation coexisted, hope and hardship intertwined. A new form of society was slowly and arduously gestating on this ancient land. The seeds of the future United States were planted in these scattered colonial beginnings. The next century and a half would witness the flourishing of these colonies, the shaping of their identities, and their eventual journey toward union and rebellion. Chapter 2: The Colonial Period and the Road to Revolution, 1607 to 1775. From the early 17th century to the mid-18th century, the number of British colonies on the North American East Coast grew, eventually forming 13 distinct yet increasingly interconnected colonial regions. These colonies are typically divided into three main areas: New England, the Middle Colonies, and the Southern Colonies. The New England colonies, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, were initially centered around Puritan faith. Society was relatively cohesive, with towns as the primary organizational units, churches and schools at their core. Education was highly valued, and literacy rates were relatively high. Due to poorer soil and a colder climate, large-scale plantation agriculture was difficult. The economy was based on small family farms, fishing, whaling, shipbuilding, lumbering, and trade. Commercial acumen thrived, and port cities like Boston gradually became major trade centers. Although initially pursuing religious purity, internal dissent arose. Roger Williams was banished from Massachusetts for advocating separation of church and state and fair treatment of Native Americans, founding the more tolerant colony of Rhode Island. And Hutchinson was also expelled for challenging doctrinal authority. The Salem witch trials, 1692, exposed the dark side of religious extremism and community pressure. The Middle Colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, were the most culturally diverse and religiously tolerant region. New York, originally Dutch New Amsterdam, retained its cosmopolitan and commercial character after British takeover. Pennsylvania was founded by the Quaker William Penn, who advocated religious freedom, pacifism, and fair dealings with Native Americans, though this ideal was later challenged by reality. This region attracted diverse immigrants from England, Germany, Scotland, Ireland, and elsewhere, forming a mixed society. Fertile land made agriculture, especially wheat cultivation, highly productive, earning it the nickname bread colonies. Philadelphia rapidly grew into one of North America's largest and most cosmopolitan cities, a center of intellectual exchange and commerce. The Southern colonies, Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, had a warm, humid climate and vast fertile lands suitable for large-scale plantation agriculture. Tobacco, Virginia, Maryland, rice and indigo, South Carolina, Georgia, became the primary cash crops. This economic model heavily relied on labor. Initially, it depended mainly on indentured servants from Britain who agreed to work for several years in exchange for passage to America. However, as indentured servants completed their terms and gained freedom, and as the demand for a more stable and controllable labor force increased, the institution of African slavery rapidly developed and solidified in the South. By the 18th century, forcibly imported Africans and their descendants became the main labor force on Southern plantations. This not only shaped the South's economic structure, but also created a hierarchical, racially segregated social order, planting deep roots for future conflict. Maryland was initially founded as a haven for Catholics, but Protestants later became the majority. Georgia was the last colony established, intended initially as a place for debtors and as a buffer against Spanish Florida. Despite significant regional differences, the 13 colonies gradually developed some common characteristics and trends. First was rapid population growth and diversification. Besides English immigrants, there were large numbers of Germans, Scots-Irish, Dutch, French Huguenots, Swedes, and forcibly brought Africans. This diversity laid the foundation for future American culture, but also brought challenges of integration and conflict. Second was gradual economic development and ties with the mother country. Colonial economies were part of the British mercantilist system. Under laws like the Navigation Acts, colonial trade was restricted. Many products could only be exported to Britain, and transport required British ships. Colonies primarily supplied raw materials, timber, furs, tobacco, rice, indigo, etc., to Britain and served as markets for British manufactured goods. While this system somewhat fostered colonial economic development, like shipbuilding, it also bred resentment among colonial merchants, and smuggling was rampant. Third was the evolution of social structures. Colonial society was generally more fluid than European society, with greater opportunities for land ownership and less rigid class boundaries. However, equality was far from universal. Landowners, primarily white men, held the most power and social status. Women's rights were limited, mainly confined to domestic affairs. Native American lands were continually encroached upon, their living spaces severely squeezed, leading to frequent conflicts with colonists, e.g., King Philip's War. African slaves occupied the lowest rung of society, stripped of basic human rights. Their suffering formed the dark underside of colonial prosperity. Fourth was the germination and growth of self-governance. Far from the mother country, colonists gradually developed traditions of self-management in practice. Nearly every colony had an elected assembly, like Virginia's House of Burgesses, the earliest representative body in North America, responsible for local laws and taxes. Although governors were usually appointed by the British Crown, assemblies often constrained the governor's power by controlling the budget. Colonists grew accustomed to handling their own internal affairs, believing they possessed the rights of Englishmen, including representative government and freedom from arbitrary taxation. Fifth was the evolution of ideas. Enlightenment thought from 17th and 18th century Europe spread to the North American colonies through books, newspapers, and personal interactions. John Locke's theories on natural rights, life, liberty, property, the social contract, and government legitimacy deriving from the consent of the governed profoundly influenced colonial intellectuals. Native thinkers like Benjamin Franklin embodied the Enlightenment spirit of reason, pragmatism, and scientific curiosity. Concurrently, the Great Awakening, a religious revival movement sweeping the colonies in the 1730s and 1740s, emphasized personal faith experience and emotional engagement, challenging traditional church authority and also fostering intercolonial connections and a shared sense of identity. By the mid-18th century, the British North American colonies had evolved into a vibrant yet complex collection of societies. They were British subjects, but geographically, economically, and socially, the seeds of a distinct American identity had begun to sprout. This sense of identity would be severely tested in the coming decades by dramatic changes in the relationship with the mother country. The turning point came with the French and Indian War, known as the 7 Years' War in Europe, fought from 1754 to 1763. This conflict was part of a global struggle between Britain and France for colonial supremacy, manifesting in North America primarily as clashes between British forces and their colonial militias against the French and their Native American allies. Initially, British and colonial forces faced setbacks. George Washington emerged as a prominent figure leading Virginia militia. Ultimately, Britain's powerful navy and significant investment secured a decisive victory, capturing vast French territories in Canada and east of the Mississippi River. However, The victory sowed the seeds of revolution. Firstly, the war massively depleted the British treasury, leading the British government to believe that the colonies, as primary beneficiaries, should bear part of the war costs and future frontier defense expenses. Secondly, to avoid further conflict with Native Americans, the British government issued the Proclamation of 1763 forbidding colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. This angered many colonists and land speculators eager for westward expansion. Thirdly, during the war, colonists fought alongside British regulars for a common cause, strengthening intercolonial ties and coordination, while also highlighting differences in attitudes and treatment compared to the British Army, fostering a greater sense of their own capabilities. After the war, the British government began adjusting its policies towards the colonies, seeking to tighten control and increase revenue to cover the deficit. A series of measures followed. The Sugar Act of 1764 aimed to curb smuggling and, for the first time, explicitly sought to raise revenue by taxing imported goods. The Stamp Act of 1765 required all printed materials in the colonies, newspapers, legal documents, playing cards, etc., to bear a purchase tax stamp. This was Britain's first attempt at direct internal taxation, rather than indirect taxes through trade regulation. It provoked fierce opposition in the colonies, who rallied under the slogan, "No taxation without representation," arguing that only their own elected assemblies had the right to tax them. Protests erupted, organizations like the Sons of Liberty formed, boycotts of British goods were organized, and even violence occurred. Facing intense pressure, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, but simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. In 1767, Britain introduced the Townshend Acts, imposing duties on imported goods like glass, lead, paper, and tea. Part of the revenue was intended to pay the salaries of colonial officials, undermining the colonial assembly's financial leverage. This again sparked boycotts and protests. On March 5, 1770, British soldiers fired into a protesting crowd in Boston, killing several people in what became known as the Boston Massacre, further inflaming tensions. Subsequently, the British government repealed most Townshend duties, except the tax on tea, maintained as a symbol of Parliament's right to tax. The following few years saw a relative calm, but anti-British sentiment simmered. Committees of correspondence were established across the colonies, strengthening communication and coordination. The Tea Act of 1773 became the new flashpoint, designed to help the struggling British East India Company by granting it a monopoly on the American tea market. It allowed the company to sell tea directly to the colonies at prices lower even than smuggled tea. However, colonists viewed it as a ploy to force them to accept taxation, as the tea still carried the residual Townshend duty and harmed colonial merchants. On December 16, 1773, a group of Boston Sons of Liberty disguised as Native Americans boarded East India Company ships and dumped tea worth tens of thousands of pounds into the harbor, an event known as the Boston Tea Party. This act enraged the British government. In retaliation, Parliament passed a series of punitive measures in 1774 known as the Intolerable Acts, or Coercive Acts. These included closing the port of Boston until the tea was paid for, restricting Massachusetts self-government, and increasing the governor's power, allowing British officials accused of crimes in the colonies to be tried in Britain or other colonies, and a new quartering act requiring colonies to house British troops. The concurrent Quebec Act expanded Quebec's boundaries and recognized Catholicism there, further alarming the predominantly Protestant 13 colonies. The Intolerable Acts were widely seen as a threat to the liberties of all colonies. To coordinate a response, delegates from 12 colonies, Georgia absent, convened the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in the fall of 1774. The Congress adopted a Declaration of Rights, reaffirming colonists' rights as British citizens, condemned the Intolerable Acts, resolved to implement a stricter trade boycott, and called on colonies to strengthen their militias and prepare for armed resistance. It also agreed to reconvene the following spring if the British government did not repeal the acts. However, hopes for reconciliation dwindled. The British government was determined to assert its authority, and the colonies grew increasingly resolved in their resistance. Both sides prepared for the inevitable conflict. On April 19, 1775, British troops stationed in Boston marched towards Concord to seize colonial militia arms. En route, in Lexington, they encountered assembled militiamen, known as Minutemen, ready to fight at a minute's notice. The shot heard round the world was fired. Later, at Concord Bridge, another clash occurred. As the British troops retreated to Boston, they were continuously harassed by militia, suffering heavy casualties. The shots fired at Lexington and Concord ended the long period of peace in the colonial era and ignited the American Revolutionary War. From initially seeking to defend their rights within the British Empire, the people of the colonies had embarked on a path of struggle, reflection, and sacrifice that would lead them to ultimately break away and fight for independence. The next chapter will witness how this fight for freedom unfolded and how a new nation was born amidst war and ideals. Chapter 3: The Revolutionary War, the Constitution, and the Early Republic, 1775 to 1815. Following the clashes at Lexington and Concord, armed conflict spread rapidly. Thousands of militiamen from across New England besieged Boston, trapping the British forces within the city. In May 1775, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. While most delegates still hoped for reconciliation with Britain, they also recognized the need to prepare for war. The Congress decided to form a unified Continental Army and appointed George Washington of Virginia as its commander-in-chief. Washington not only possessed military experience from the French and Indian War, but his Southern background also helped unite the diverse colonies. The Congress also began issuing paper currency to finance the war effort and started managing diplomatic affairs. The early war saw mixed results. In June 1775, near Boston at Bunker Hill, though the main fighting occurred on Breed's Hill, colonial militia inflicted heavy casualties on the British before being forced to withdraw due to lack of ammunition, demonstrating their tenacious fighting spirit. Meanwhile, the Continental Congress made a final peace effort, sending the Olive Branch Petition to King George III, expressing loyalty and asking the king to intervene with Parliament to restore colonial rights. However, George III refused the petition and declared the colonies in a state of rebellion. As the war continued and Britain's stance hardened, coupled with the widespread circulation of Thomas Paine's highly influential pamphlet Common Sense, published early 1776, which eloquently argued in plain language for the necessity of independence and the superiority of Republican government, the call for independence grew louder. In June 1776, the Continental Congress appointed a committee, including Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams, to draft a Declaration of Independence. Jefferson penned the initial draft, which, after revisions by the committee and the full Congress, was formally adopted on July 4, 1776. This day later became America's Independence Day. The Declaration of Independence not only proclaimed the 13 colony separation from British rule to become free and independent states, the United States of America, but more importantly, it articulated profound political philosophy. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. These Enlightenment principles became the cornerstone of American nationhood and an aspirational beacon, although in practice at the time, these rights were not equally extended to all, such as slaves, women, and the propertyless. The Declaration meant the war's objective shifted from securing rights to achieving complete independence. There was no turning back. However, the war proved exceptionally difficult. The Continental Army was vastly inferior to the powerful British military in terms of equipment, training, supplies, and numbers. Washington's army suffered repeated defeats and endured severe hardships. In the fall and winter of 1776, the British captured New York City, forcing Washington into retreat. That frigid winter, Washington's surprise victories at Trenton and Princeton, though small in scale, significantly boosted the morale of the near-collapsing American forces. The turning point of the war came at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. American forces successfully surrounded and forced the surrender of a British army that had advanced deep into New York. This victory was crucial. It thwarted the British strategy to isolate New England and, critically, convince France that the Americans were capable of winning the war. In 1778, France formally recognized American independence and signed a treaty of military alliance. Spain and the Netherlands later joined the fight against Britain. French aid, including naval support, troops, weapons, and funding, proved vital to the eventual American victory. Despite foreign assistance, the war remained arduous. During the winter of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge, the Continental Army endured extreme cold, hunger, and disease. Yet, under the leadership of Washington and Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer who helped train the army, the forces persevered and improved their combat effectiveness. The focus of the war gradually shifted south. The British achieved some victories in the south, capturing Charleston and utilizing Loyalist support. However, American forces under commanders like Nathaniel Greene employed flexible guerrilla tactics, continually wearing down the British. The final decisive confrontation occurred at Yorktown, Virginia, in 1781. A combined American and French force, commanded by Washington, besieged the main British army, led by General Cornwallis. Crucially, the French Navy blockaded Chesapeake Bay, cutting off British sea escape routes. Cornwallis was forced to surrender on October 19, 1781. The victory at Yorktown marked the definitive end of the Revolutionary War's military struggle. Following the war, the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783. Britain formally recognized American independence and confirmed the new nation's boundaries: east to the Atlantic, west to the Mississippi River, north to the Great Lakes region, and south to Florida, which was returned to Spain. The United States had won its independence, but faced the daunting task of building a new nation. Even during the war, the Continental Congress had begun establishing a national framework. In 1777, it adopted the Articles of Confederation, which went into effect in 1781 after ratification by all states. This was America's first constitution. The Articles created a loose confederation of states with a very weak central government, the Confederation Congress. Congress could declare war, make peace, sign treaties, manage the postal service, and deal with Native American affairs. But it lacked the power to tax. It could only request funds from the states, maintain a standing army, create a uniform currency, or establish independent executive and judicial branches. Major decisions required the approval of 9 states, and amending the Articles required unanimous consent of all 13 states. This week's central government soon revealed serious problems. The nation struggled financially, unable to pay war debts. Trade barriers and currency confusion existed between states. The central government was ineffective in resolving disputes with foreign powers, like Britain and Spain, and maintaining domestic order. In 1786 to 1787, Shays' Rebellion erupted in Massachusetts, led by indebted farmers, many Revolutionary War veterans, protesting high taxes and property foreclosures. The Confederation government's inability to effectively suppress the uprising highlighted its impotence. Facing this crisis, a growing number of influential figures recognized the need for a stronger central government. In the summer of 1787, delegates from 12 states, Rhode Island did not attend, gathered in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. Initially intended to revise the Articles of Confederation, the delegates, including Washington, Madison, Hamilton, Franklin, and others, known as the Founding Fathers, soon decided to discard the old framework entirely and design a new federal government. The convention was filled with intense debate and difficult compromises. Key points of contention included: power distribution between federal and state governments. The principle of federalism was established, dividing power between the national government and state governments. The federal government was granted specific enumerated powers like taxation, regulating interstate commerce, declaring war, with remaining powers reserved to the states. Federal law was made supreme over state law. Representation of large versus small states. Large states favored proportional representation in Congress based on population, Virginia Plan, while small states insisted on equal representation for each state, New Jersey Plan. The Connecticut Compromise, or Great Compromise, resolved this by creating a bicameral Congress. The Senate, with 2 senators per state, equal representation, and the House of Representatives, with seats allocated based on state population, representing the people. The issue of slavery. Southern states insisted on counting slaves towards their population for representation in the House, but opposed counting them for taxation purposes. Northern states held the opposite view. The 3/5 compromise was reached, stipulating that for purposes of representation and direct taxation, each enslaved person would be counted as 3/5 of a free person. The convention also agreed not to prohibit the importation of slaves for 20 years, until 1808. These compromises, while enabling the Constitution's adoption, sowed the seeds for the future Civil War. Creation and powers of the executive branch. The convention established a strong, single executive, the president, serving a 4-year term and elected indirectly through the Electoral College system. The president was granted executive power, military command, the authority to appoint officials and judges, and the power to veto legislation passed by Congress. Establishment of the judicial branch. A federal Supreme Court was created, and Congress was authorized to establish lower federal courts. The judiciary was tasked with interpreting the Constitution and federal laws and handling cases involving the federal government. After nearly 4 months of secret deliberations, the Constitutional Convention adopted the Constitution of the United States on September 17, 1787. The Constitution established the principles of separation of powers, legislative, executive, judicial, and checks and balances designed to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful. The Constitution was then submitted to the states for ratification. This process sparked fierce debate, dividing proponents into Federalists who supported the Constitution like Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay, authors of the Federalist Papers defending it, and Anti-Federalists who feared excessive central power infringing on state and individual liberties. To secure enough support, Federalists promised to add a Bill of Rights once the new government was established. By the summer of 1788, 9 states had ratified the Constitution, meeting the requirement for it to take effect. In 1789, the new government was formally launched, with George Washington elected as the first president. In 1791, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, known as the Bill of Rights, were ratified, guaranteeing fundamental individual liberties. These include freedoms of speech, religion, the press, and assembly, the right to keep and bear arms, protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, the right to a fair trial, and several other essential rights. During Washington's presidency, 1789 to 1797, the foundations of the new government were laid. He established the cabinet system. Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton implemented crucial financial policies, creating a national bank, assuming state war debts, issuing bonds, imposing tariffs and excise taxes, which stabilized the nation's finances and promoted commerce and industry. However, Hamilton's policies also generated controversy, leading to the formation of America's first political parties. The Federalists, led by Hamilton, favoring a strong central government, commercial interests, pro-British, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, advocating states' rights, agrarian interests, pro-French. Upon leaving office after his second term, Washington delivered his famous farewell address, warning against the dangers of factionalism, partisan strife, and advising the nation to maintain neutrality in foreign affairs, avoiding entanglement in Europe's perennial conflicts, an early expression of the principle of isolationism. The second president, John Adams, Federalist, 1797 to 1801, faced tense relations with France, nearly leading to war, the Quasi-War. Domestically, his administration passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, restricting immigrant rights and suppressing criticism of the government, sparking concerns about free speech and prompting Jefferson and Madison to draft the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which asserted states' rights and the doctrine of nullification. In the election of 1800, Jefferson, Democratic-Republican, defeated Adams, marking the first peaceful transfer of power between opposing parties in U.S. history. During his presidency, 1801 to 1809, Jefferson aimed to reduce government spending, lower the national debt, and adhere to principles of limited government. His most famous achievement was the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. The U.S. bought a vast territory from Napoleonic France for $15 million, stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, nearly doubling the nation's size and vastly expanding opportunities for development. Jefferson dispatched the Lewis and Clark expedition to explore this new territory. However, American attempts to remain neutral during the Napoleonic Wars grew increasingly difficult. Both Britain and France interfered with American maritime trade, and the British Navy engaged in the impressment, forced enlistment of American sailors. Jefferson's administration tried using economic pressure with the Embargo Act of 1807, prohibiting American ships from sailing to foreign ports, but the act severely damaged the U.S. economy and was eventually repealed. Jefferson's successor, James Madison, Democratic-Republican, 1809 to 1817, inherited these thorny diplomatic issues. British violations of American maritime rights continued, and Britain was suspected of inciting Native American resistance to U.S. expansion in the Northwest Territory. Pushed by war hawks, young congressmen advocating a hard line against Britain, the United States declared war on Great Britain in 1812, known as the War of 1812. This war proved challenging for the U.S. Attempts to invade Canada failed. The British imposed a naval blockade and briefly captured Washington, D.C., burning the White House and Capitol Building, 1814. However, the U.S. achieved victories in some naval battles, like the USS Constitution, and secured key defensive land victories, such as at Fort McHenry near Baltimore, inspiring Francis Scott Key to write the Star-Spangled Banner, later the national anthem, and Andrew Jackson's decisive victory at the Battle of New Orleans in early 1815, fought after the peace treaty was signed but before news arrived. The war concluded with the signing of the Treaty of Ghent in late 1814, restoring the pre-war status quo, leaving issues like boundaries unresolved. Although militarily inconclusive in terms of territorial gains for the U.S., the War of 1812 had significant consequences. It boosted American nationalism and national identity, weakened Native American resistance to westward expansion, stimulated domestic manufacturing due to the interruption of British imports, and ultimately solidified American independence, earning respect from European powers. This war also marked the end of the early Republic period, ushering in a new era of greater self-confidence, focused on internal development and westward expansion. Chapter 4: Expansion, Division, and Civil War, 1815 to 1865. After the War of 1812, the United States entered a period known as the Era of Good Feelings, largely due to the decline of the Federalist Party, which lessened partisan strife for a time, and a surge in nationalism. Beneath this surface harmony, however, profound socioeconomic changes and latent conflicts were brewing, particularly the increasingly sharp divisions surrounding westward expansion and the institution of slavery. Westward expansion and manifest destiny. In the first half of the 19th century, the United States experienced rapid territorial expansion and westward migration. Millions of Americans crossed the Appalachian Mountains, pouring into the Mississippi River Valley and beyond. Underlying this expansion was a belief known as manifest destiny. This ideology held that the United States was divinely ordained to expand across the entire North American continent, spreading its democratic institutions, liberal values, and Protestant culture. It was both an expression of nationalistic ambition and an ideological justification for dispossessing Native Americans of their lands and engaging in conflict with neighboring countries, primarily Mexico. Expansion occurred through several means. Purchase and treaties. Following the Louisiana Purchase, the U.S. acquired Florida from Spain through the Adams-Onis Treaty in 1819. A long-standing dispute with Britain over the Oregon Territory was resolved in 1846 by a treaty establishing the northern border at the 49th parallel. Settlement. Thousands of pioneers traveled west along routes like the Oregon Trail, California Trail, and Santa Fe Trail in covered wagons, overcoming immense hardships to seek land and opportunity. Forced removal of Native Americans. Westward expansion was accompanied by the relentless encroachment on Native American lands and the destruction of their ways of life. Under President Andrew Jackson, 1829 to 1837, a policy of forced Indian removal was implemented. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 authorized the government to forcibly relocate tribes living east of the Mississippi River to designated Indian territory, primarily in present-day Oklahoma. Even the 5 civilized tribes, Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, Choctaw, and Chickasaw, who had adopted many aspects of white culture, including written languages, constitutions, and farms, were not spared. During the forced migrations, particularly the Cherokee journey, known as the Trail of Tears, thousands of Native Americans died from starvation, disease, and exposure. This is a tragic and unjust chapter in American history. Mexican-American War. American settlers increasingly moved into Texas, then part of Mexico. In 1836, Texas declared independence and was annexed by the United States in 1845. This led to a border dispute with Mexico. In 1846, the U.S. declared war on Mexico. The U.S. military held a decisive advantage, eventually capturing Mexico City. Under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848, Mexico was forced to cede a vast territory, including present-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming, known as the Mexican Cession, to the United States. The U.S. paid Mexico $15 million. In 1853, the U.S. acquired a smaller piece of land in southern Arizona through the Gadsden Purchase. This largely completed the map of the contiguous United States, excluding Alaska and Hawaii. Northern industrialization versus southern slavery. Concurrent with expansion, the socioeconomic structures of the North and South diverged significantly. The North experienced rapid industrialization and urbanization. The textile industry led the way, followed by iron, steel, and machinery manufacturing. Factories attracted large populations from rural areas and drew waves of European immigrants, especially Irish and Germans. A transportation revolution occurred. The construction of canals, like the Erie Canal, the development of a railroad network, and the use of steamboats greatly facilitated the movement of goods and connected regions. The northern economy became increasingly diversified, based on free labor, with commerce, finance, and industry dominating. While wealth disparities and hardships for the working class existed, social mobility was relatively higher and values emphasized individual enterprise and free markets. The South maintained a predominantly agricultural economy, especially large-scale plantation agriculture. After Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in 1793 made cleaning short-staple cotton efficient, cotton cultivation became immensely profitable, and the Cotton Kingdom rapidly expanded across the Deep South. Cotton became America's most important export, supplying crucial raw material for northern textile mills in Britain's Industrial Revolution. However, the prosperity of the cotton economy was inextricably linked to the institution of slavery. Southern society and economy were built upon enslaved labor. Although only a minority of whites owned large numbers of slaves, the entire Southern society defended slavery, viewing it as a way of life and a property right. Southern society was rigidly hierarchical, with the planter class wielding immense political and economic power. Compared to the North, the South industrialized slowly, had lower levels of urbanization, fewer immigrants, and lower rates of educational attainment. Growing sectional tensions. Over time, the differences between North and South extended beyond economics to politics, culture, and values. The central conflict revolved around the existence of slavery and its status in newly acquired territories. In the North, widespread anti-slavery sentiment gradually formed. The abolitionist movement emerged, featuring figures like William Lloyd Garrison, founder of the Liberator newspaper, Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave and renowned orator and writer, Harriet Tubman, an organizer of the Underground Railroad, helping slaves escape to free states or Canada, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, whose novel Uncle Tom's Cabin powerfully depicted the cruelty of slavery. They argued that slavery violated the principles of equality in the Declaration of Independence and Christian morality, deeming it immoral. The South vehemently defended slavery, considering it the foundation of their economic and social order, a property right protected by the Constitution, and even arguing it was beneficial for black people themselves, the peculiar institution narrative. They reacted with anger and felt threatened by Northern abolitionist calls. The conflict repeatedly flared up in Congress over the status of new territories. Missouri Compromise, 1820. Missouri's application for statehood as a slave state sparked a crisis, as it would upset the balance between free and slave states in the Senate. A compromise was reached. Missouri entered as a slave state, while Maine, carved from Massachusetts, entered as a free state, maintaining the balance. Furthermore, slavery was prohibited in the Louisiana Purchase territory north of the 36 degrees 30 minutes parallel, except for Missouri. This temporarily eased the crisis, but also drew a geographical dividing line. Territorial issues after Texas annexation and the Mexican-American War. The vast lands acquired from Mexico reignited the debate over whether slavery should extend into these areas. The Wilmot Proviso, proposed by Northern congressmen to ban slavery in the new territories, failed to pass. Compromise of 1850. Intense confrontation arose again over issues like California's application for statehood as a free state. Through the efforts of Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and Stephen Douglas, a package deal was brokered. California admitted as a free state. The territories of New Mexico and Utah would decide on slavery based on popular sovereignty, allowing local residents to vote. The slave trade, but not slavery itself, was banned in Washington, D.C., and a stricter Fugitive Slave Act was passed, requiring Northern citizens and officials to assist in capturing escaped slaves. This Fugitive Slave Act provoked outrage in the North, intensifying animosity. Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854, proposed by Stephen Douglas to facilitate the construction of a transcontinental railroad. This act divided the Nebraska Territory into two, Kansas and Nebraska, and stipulated that the issue of slavery in both territories would also be decided by popular sovereignty. This effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise's 36 degrees 30 minutes line restriction, potentially allowing slavery to expand northward. The act triggered fierce protests in the North, led to the collapse of the Whig Party, and spurred the formation of the anti-slavery expansion Republican Party, 1854. Following its passage, pro- and anti-slavery settlers rushed into Kansas to influence the vote, leading to violent clashes known as Bleeding Kansas. Dred Scott versus Sanford, 1857. The Supreme Court delivered a disastrous ruling. It held that black people, whether enslaved or free, were not U.S. citizens and had no right to sue in federal court. Slaves were property, and Congress had no power to prohibit slave owners from taking their slaves into federal territories, rendering the Missouri Compromise and popular sovereignty meaningless. Dred Scott's residence in free territory did not grant him freedom. This decision inflamed sectional tensions, infuriating abolitionists and Republicans, while Southerners hailed it as a victory. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, 1859. Radical abolitionist John Brown led a small group in an attack on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia, attempting to seize weapons and incite a slave uprising. The raid failed, and Brown was captured and executed. He was viewed as a martyr by many in the North, but as a terrorist in the South, deepening Southern fears about Northern intentions. Lincoln's election and Southern secession. The presidential election of 1860 became the breaking point. The Republican Party nominated Abraham Lincoln, whose platform opposed the expansion of slavery, though not advocating immediate abolition in existing slave states. The Democratic Party split over the slavery issue. Lincoln won the election based on overwhelming support in the North, despite not receiving a single electoral vote from a Southern state. Southern states viewed Lincoln's election as a direct threat to their way of life and the institution of slavery. South Carolina seceded from a union in December 1860. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas quickly followed. In February 1861, these 7 states met in Montgomery, Alabama, declared the formation of the Confederate States of America, elected Jefferson Davis as president, and adopted their own constitution explicitly protecting slavery. The Lincoln administration refused to recognize secession, viewing it as a legal rebellion. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, a federal fort in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, forcing its surrender. This event marked the official beginning of the American Civil War. Following the attack on Fort Sumter, Lincoln called on the states to provide troops to suppress the rebellion. This prompted 4 more Upper South states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, to join the Confederacy. Ultimately, 11 states formed the Confederacy, with its capital moved to Richmond, Virginia. The border slave states that remained in the Union, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, became critical areas contested by both sides. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. The Civil War was the bloodiest and most decisive conflict in American history. The initial goal of the North, the Union, was to preserve the Union, but as the war progressed, abolishing slavery became a central objective. The South, the Confederacy, fought to maintain its independence and the institution of slavery. Advantages and disadvantages. Union, North held significant advantages in population, approximate 22 million versus 5.5 million white Southerners, industrial capacity, railroad mileage, naval power, and financial resources. Possessed an established government and military structure. Confederacy, South had superior military leadership early on, e.g., Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, soldiers more familiar with the terrain, and high morale fighting to defend their homes. Achieved a series of victories in the Eastern Theater early in the war. Hoped to gain recognition and aid from European powers like Britain and France through a cotton embargo, ultimately unsuccessful. Major battles and course of the war. The war was fought primarily in 2 main theaters, the Eastern Theater, around Virginia, and the Western Theater, Mississippi River Valley. Eastern Theater, early Confederate victories under General Lee, e.g., 1st and 2nd Bull Run, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville. Union forces, despite numerical superiority, suffered from leadership issues. The crucial turning point was the Battle of Gettysburg, July 1863. Lee attempted an invasion of the North, but was defeated by the Union Army, commanded by General Meade, in Pennsylvania. Gettysburg was one of the largest and deadliest battles of the war, marking the end of the Confederacy's ability to launch major strategic offensives. In November of that year, Lincoln delivered his famous Gettysburg Address at the dedication of the National Cemetery there, eloquently articulating the war's purpose as preserving a government of the people, by the people, for the people. Western Theater, Union forces under commanders like Ulysses S. Grant made more consistent progress. Grant captured Forts Henry and Donelson, gaining control of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. A key victory was the capture of Vicksburg after a siege, ending on July 4, 1863. Vicksburg was the last major Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. Its fall gave the Union complete control of the river, splitting the Confederacy in 2. Emancipation Proclamation. After the Battle of Antietam, an extremely bloody battle strategically favorable to the North, in September 1862, Lincoln issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The formal Emancipation Proclamation took effect on January 1st, 1863. It declared that all slaves in the rebellious states, i.e., Confederate-controlled territory, shall be thenceforward, and forever free. While it did not immediately free all slaves, excluding those in border states and Union-controlled areas of the South, it had immense symbolic and practical significance. It elevated the war's aim explicitly to include the abolition of slavery, gained international moral support, especially discouraging British and French intervention, and allowed African Americans to enlist in the Union Army. Nearly 200,000 black soldiers made crucial contributions to the Union victory. Later war and conclusion. In 1864, Lincoln appointed Grant as General-in-Chief of all Union armies. Grant adopted a strategy of total war, aiming to destroy the South's capacity and will to fight. In the East, Grant waged a relentless war of attrition, e.g. battles of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, suffering heavy casualties but steadily pushing towards Richmond. In the West, General William T. Sherman conducted his famous March to the Sea, leading troops on a destructive path from Atlanta to the Georgia coast, devastating Southern infrastructure and resources. By early 1865, the Confederacy's defeat was imminent. Richmond fell in early April. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered his army to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Other Confederate forces surrendered soon after. The Civil War was over. Lincoln's assassination. Just days after the war's end, on the evening of April 14, 1865, President Lincoln was assassinated while attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer and actor. Lincoln died the following morning. The death of the president who had led the nation through its greatest crisis, preserved the Union, and initiated the process of emancipation, brought immense grief to the nation and cast a shadow over the impending era of Reconstruction. The Civil War was a watershed moment in American history. It came at the terrible cost of approximately 620,000 soldiers' lives, more than the combined total of all other American wars, but ultimately preserved the Union, abolished slavery, confirmed by the post-war 13th Amendment, and established the supremacy of the federal government over the states. However, the wounds of war were far from healed. The daunting challenges of rebuilding the South and integrating millions of newly freed African Americans into society would define the next era, Reconstruction. Chapter 5, Reconstruction, Industrialization, and the Rise to World Power, 1865 to 1918. With the smoke of the Civil War cleared, the United States faced unprecedented challenges. How to reunite a divided nation. How to rebuild the war-torn Southern economy and social order. Most critically, how to define and secure the rights and status of the roughly 4 million African Americans newly freed from slavery. This period, known as Reconstruction, roughly 1865 to 1877, was filled with hope, conflict, progress, and setbacks. The Reconstruction era, 1865 to 1877, Presidential Reconstruction. After Lincoln's assassination, Vice President Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat from Tennessee who remained loyal to the Union, became president. Johnson favored a lenient Reconstruction policy, hoping to quickly restore the Southern states to the Union. He required Southern states to nullify their secession ordinances, ratify the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, which took effect in late 1865, and pledge allegiance to the Union. However, he was hesitant about guaranteeing black rights and pardoned many former Confederate leaders. Based on this, many Southern states quickly formed new governments, often dominated by ex-Confederates, which enacted discriminatory laws known as black codes. These codes aimed to restrict black freedoms and tie them to conditions resembling slavery, e.g., limiting land ownership, certain occupations, freedom of movement. Congressional, radical, Reconstruction, radical Republicans in Congress, led by figures like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, were deeply dissatisfied with Johnson's leniency and the Southern Black Codes. They advocated for a more thorough transformation of Southern society to ensure Black civil and political rights. Congress clashed fiercely with President Johnson and ultimately took control of Reconstruction. Congress passed, often overriding presidential vetoes. Freedmen's Bureau Act established the Freedmen's Bureau to provide food, medical care, education, and legal assistance to refugees, both Black and white, in the South, and help Black people negotiate labor contracts and establish schools and courts. The Bureau played a significant role in improving conditions for Black people, especially in promoting education. Civil Rights Act of 1866 declared that all persons born in the United States, excluding untaxed Native Americans, were citizens and entitled to equal protection under the law. 14th Amendment, ratified 1868, one of the most important amendments in U.S. constitutional history. It enshrined birthright citizenship. All persons born or naturalized in the U.S. are citizens, and the principles of due process of law and equal protection of the laws applicable to the states. It aimed to secure Black civil rights and provided a crucial legal foundation for later civil rights movements. Reconstruction Acts of 1867 divided the South, except Tennessee, which had ratified the 14th Amendment, into 5 military districts under martial law, required Southern states to hold new constitutional conventions, draft new constitutions granting Black suffrage, and ratify the 14th Amendment to regain federal recognition and representation in Congress. 15th Amendment, ratified 1870, prohibited the federal or state governments from denying a citizen the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. However, it did not prohibit restrictions based on gender, property, or literacy. Changes and resistance in the South. During Radical Reconstruction, new Republican governments were established in the Southern states, typically composed of carpetbaggers, Northerners who moved south, scalawags, white Southerners who supported Reconstruction, and newly enfranchised African Americans. Black men achieved unprecedented political participation. They voted in large numbers and were elected to local, state, and even federal offices, including senators and representatives. These Reconstruction governments implemented progressive measures like establishing public school systems, reforming taxes, and building infrastructure. However, Reconstruction faced immense resistance. Many white Southerners resented Black political power and Northern intervention. They used violence and intimidation to oppose Reconstruction. Secret societies like the Ku Klux Klan terrorized Black people, Republicans, and their supporters through lynchings, beatings, arson, and murder. The end of Reconstruction. By the 1870s, Northern resolve for Reconstruction weakened. Persistent Southern violence, economic depression, Panic of 1873, concerns about government corruption, and weariness with continuous intervention in Southern affairs led many to desire an end to Reconstruction. The disputed presidential election of 1876 between Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden brought matters to a head. The crisis was resolved through the informal compromise of 1877. Democrats agreed to accept Hayes as president in exchange for the Republicans agreeing to withdraw the last federal troops from the South. The removal of federal troops effectively marked the end of the Reconstruction era. White Southern Democrats, known as Redeemers, quickly regained control of state governments throughout the South. Legacy of Reconstruction. Reconstruction was a complex and contradictory era. It established constitutional guarantees for Black citizenship and suffrage, though these rights were later systematically denied in the South, laying the groundwork for future civil rights struggles. It experimented with interracial democracy and achieved some social progress, like public education. However, Reconstruction ultimately failed to fundamentally alter the South's racial hierarchy or fully protect Black rights. Its end ushered in a long era of Jim Crow in the South, characterized by segregation laws, disenfranchisement through poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and pervasive violence and discrimination, relegating African Americans to second-class citizenship. The failures of Reconstruction left deep historical scars and unfinished business. The Gilded Age, industrialization, wealth, and social conflict, c. 1870s and 1900. After Reconstruction, the United States entered a period of rapid economic growth intertwined with significant social problems, ironically termed the Gilded Age by Mark Twain, suggesting a glittering surface masking underlying issues. Second Industrial Revolution. Industrialization surged forward at an unprecedented pace and scale. Technological innovations abounded. The Bessemer process dramatically increased steel production. Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, phonograph, and developed power generation systems. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. Petroleum extraction and refining techniques advanced rapidly. Railroad construction continued aggressively, creating a national network connecting coasts, facilitating a national market, and enabling resource exploitation. Rise of titans and monopolies. Industrialization gave rise to entrepreneurs known as robber barons or captains of industry. Figures like Andrew Carnegie, Steel, John D. Rockefeller, oil, Cornelius Vanderbilt, railroads, and J.P. Morgan, finance, built vast business empires. They amassed enormous fortunes through fierce competition, mergers, and the formation of trusts, monopolies, but also sparked concerns about monopoly power, unfair practices, and vast wealth inequality. Rockefeller's Standard Oil at one point controlled over 90% of U.S. oil refining. Mass immigration and urbanization. Industrial growth demanded vast labor, attracting a new wave of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, Italians, Poles, Russian Jews, etc., and Asia, mainly Chinese, later restricted by the Chinese Exclusion Act. These new immigrants differed more significantly in language, religion, and culture from earlier Northern and Western European immigrants, often clustering in urban ethnic neighborhoods and facing discrimination and integration challenges. Labor management conflict was frequent, with strikes, e.g., the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, Haymarket Affair of 1886, Homestead Strike of 1892, Pullman Strike of 1894, often met with forceful suppression by employers and government, sometimes resulting in bloodshed. Farmers also faced hardships from high railroad rates, falling crop prices, and debt, leading to the populist movement, which demanded government regulation of railroads and looser monetary policy, like free silver. Political corruption and reform calls. Gilded Age politics were notorious for corruption and the spoils system patronage. Politicians had close ties to big business, and bribery was common. Urban political machines, like New York's Tammany Hall, manipulated elections through controlling votes and distributing favors. These problems fueled calls for reform, demanding civil service reform, leading to the Pendleton Act of 1883, establishing merit-based hiring, antitrust legislation, the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, though initially weakly enforced, and broader social and political changes. The Progressive Era, Reform and Change, c. 1890s to 1910s. In response to the ills of the Gilded Age, a broad social and political reform movement known as the Progressive Era emerged around the turn of the 20th century. Progressives came from various backgrounds, including middle-class intellectuals, journalists, social workers, some business leaders, and politicians. They believed that government intervention, scientific methods, and social action could solve the problems caused by industrialization and urbanization, improve society, and promote fairness and justice. Exposing problems, muckraking a group of writers and journalists dubbed muckrakers, such as Ida Tarbell, exposing Standard Oil, Lincoln Steffens exposing urban corruption, and Upton Sinclair, whose novel The Jungle revealed horrific conditions in the meatpacking industry, brought societal ills to public attention through investigative reporting, galvanizing the demand for reform. Social reform. The social gospel movement applied Christian ethics to social problems, calling for aid to the poor. Social reformers like Jane Addams founded settlement houses, providing services and education to the urban poor and immigrants. Reformers pushed for legislation to improve urban sanitation and housing, ban child labor, establish minimum wages and maximum hours, and enhance factory safety. The temperance movement also gained significant momentum, arguing alcohol was a major cause of poverty, crime, and family breakdown. Political reform. Progressives sought to expand democracy and break the power of political machines. They championed reforms like the direct primary, allowing voters to nominate candidates directly, the direct election of senators, achieved through the 17th Amendment in 1913, the initiative allowing citizens to propose legislation, the referendum allowing citizens to vote on laws, and the recall allowing voters to remove officials from office. Economic reform, antitrust and regulation. President Theodore Roosevelt, 1901 to 1909, known as the Trust Buster, used the Sherman Antitrust Act to sue and break up large monopolies like the Northern Securities Company. He also pushed for stronger railroad regulation, Hepburn Act, 1906, and laws ensuring food and drug safety, Pure Food and Drug Act, 1906, Meat Inspection Act, 1906. His successor, William Howard Taft, 1909 to 1913, actually initiated more antitrust suits. President Woodrow Wilson, 1913 to 1921, further advanced economic reform, establishing the Federal Reserve System, 1913, to stabilize the financial system and money supply, passing the Clayton Antitrust Act, 1914, to strengthen antitrust enforcement, and creating the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, 1914, to regulate unfair business practices. The 16th Amendment, authorizing a federal income tax, was also ratified in 1913. Women's suffrage movement. The fight for women's right to vote reached its peak during the Progressive Era. Leaders like Susan B. Anthony, Carrie Chapman Catt, and Alice Paul organized large-scale marches, rallies, and protests. They pursued strategies at both the state level and aimed for a federal constitutional amendment. After a long struggle, the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, finally guaranteeing American women the right to vote. America steps onto the world stage, imperialism and World War I. While engaged in domestic reform, the United States also began playing a more active and expansionist role on the international stage in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Overseas expansion, driven by economic interests, seeking overseas markets and raw materials, nationalist sentiment, competing with other powers, the white man's burden ideology, a sense of duty to spread civilization, and the influence of naval strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan's theories on sea power, the U.S. sought overseas expansion. In 1867, the U.S. purchased Alaska from Russia. In 1898, it annexed the Hawaiian Islands. Spanish-American War. 1898, Cuba had long struggled against Spanish colonial rule. Sensationalist, yellow journalism in the U.S. press highlighted Spanish atrocities, and the mysterious explosion of a USS Maine in Havana Harbor fueled war fever. In 1898, the U.S. declared war on Spain. The war quickly ended in a decisive American victory. In the peace treaty, Spain ceded Cuba, nominally independent but under U.S. influence, Puerto Rico and Guam to the U.S., and sold the Philippines to the U.S. for $20 million. U.S. rule in the Philippines met armed resistance from Filipino nationalists. Philippine-American War, 1899 to 1902, which the U.S. eventually suppressed. The Spanish-American War marked the emergence of the United States as a major colonial empire. Open door policy. Facing the division of China into spheres of influence by foreign powers, U.S. Secretary of State John Hay proposed the open door policy in 1899, advocating for equal trading opportunities for all nations in China and upholding China's territorial and administrative integrity, though its practical effect was limited. Panama Canal. Theodore Roosevelt actively pursued the construction of a canal connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through Panama. With U.S. support, Panama declared independence from Colombia in 1903 and immediately signed a treaty granting the U.S. perpetual rights to build and manage the canal. Completed in 1914, the Panama Canal dramatically shortened sea voyages and held immense strategic and economic importance. Roosevelt's assertive foreign policy, big stick diplomacy, along with later dollar diplomacy, emphasizing economic investment under Taft, and moral diplomacy, stressing support for democratic nations under Wilson, reflected America's growing influence in Latin America. World War I, 1914 to 1918. When World War I erupted in Europe in 1914, the United States initially declared neutrality, with President Wilson urging Americans to be impartial in thought and action. However, as the war progressed, maintaining neutrality became increasingly difficult. Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare severely threatened American trade and lives, e.g., the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, killing American passengers, coupled with the intercepted Zimmermann telegram, a German proposal for an alliance with Mexico against the U.S., finally pushed the United States to declare war on Germany in April 1917. American entry brought formidable industrial might and fresh troops, accelerating the Allied victory. Over 4 million Americans served in the military, with about 116,000 losing their lives. The war effort involved massive domestic mobilization, expanded government power, restrictions on civil liberties, Espionage Act, Sedition Act, and intense patriotism. World War I ended in November 1918 with an Allied victory. As a victor nation, America's international stature soared. President Wilson traveled to the Paris Peace Conference armed with his 14 points, aiming to establish a new world order based on national self-determination, open diplomacy, free trade, and collective security through a League of Nations. However, his idealism clashed with the realpolitik of European powers, and resurgent isolationist sentiment at home led the U.S. Senate to reject the Treaty of Versailles and membership in the League of Nations. Nevertheless, the United States had irreversibly become a global economic and military power, its future path inextricably linked with world affairs. The coming era would witness intertwined prosperity and depression, the resurgence of World War, the Cold War standoff, and continuous transformation within American society. Chapter 6, Superpower, Cold War, and Modern America, 1918-present. The end of World War I did not bring lasting peace, but instead ushered in a new era filled with turmoil, transformation, and challenges. Although the United States rejected membership in the League of Nations and returned to a degree of isolation, its economic and cultural influence had become global. From the post-war Roaring Twenties to the agony of the Great Depression, from the crucible of World War II to the long Cold War standoff, and into the era of post-Cold War globalization and new challenges, the United States continued to write its complex and pivotal history throughout the 20th and early 21st centuries. The Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression, 1920s to 1930s. The Roaring Twenties, the decade following World War I, saw significant economic prosperity in the U.S., except in agriculture. New technologies and industries like the automobile, Henry Ford's assembly line, electricity, radio, and motion pictures flourished, fueling a consumer culture. Urbanization accelerated, and social mores became more liberal. Jazz music thrived. Women adopted more independent images, the flapper, challenging traditional values. Yet, it was also an era of contradictions. Prohibition, the 18th Amendment, 1920 to 1933, spurred bootlegging and organized crime, like Al Capone. Racism and nativism surged, with a revived Ku Klux Klan and restrictive immigration laws like the Immigration Act of 1924 targeting Southern/Eastern Europeans and Asians. Fundamentalism clashed with modernism in religion and culture, e.g., the Scopes Monkey Trial of 1925. Beneath the prosperity lurked dangers of stock market speculation and excessive credit. The Great Depression. In October 1929, the New York stock market crashed Black Tuesday, triggering the most severe and prolonged economic crisis in American history, the Great Depression. Bank failures, factory closures, soaring unemployment, reaching 25% at its peak, and farm foreclosures plunged millions into poverty and despair. President Herbert Hoover, 1929 to 1933, initially adhering to principles of limited government intervention, failed to effectively curb the crisis. The Great Depression not only devastated the American economy, but also profoundly impacted social psychology and the political landscape, with global repercussions. The New Deal. In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, was elected president and subsequently re-elected 3 times, the only president to serve more than 2 terms, on the promise of a New Deal. The New Deal was a series of government programs and legislation aimed at providing relief, promoting recovery, and implementing reform. Key measures included stabilizing the banking system, bank holiday, establishing the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, stabilizing farm prices, Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, creating jobs through agencies like the Works Progress Administration, WPA, and the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, for public works projects, guaranteeing workers' rights to organize unions and bargain collectively, National Labor Relations Act, Wagner Act, establishing a Social Security system, Social Security Act, 1935, providing support for the elderly, unemployed, and disabled, and increasing regulation of the stock market, Securities and Exchange Commission, CC, and public utilities. While the New Deal did not fully end the Great Depression, WWI's massive spending ultimately spurred full recovery. It significantly alleviated the crisis, restored public confidence, expanded the federal government's role in economic and social life, and laid the foundations for the modern American welfare state. World War II and the dawn of the Cold War, 1939, early 1950s. Road to war. As fascism and militarism rose in Germany, Hitler, Italy, Mussolini, and Japan, launching aggressive wars in Europe and Asia, the U.S. initially pursued isolationism, passing neutrality acts. However, as Axis aggression expanded, especially after the fall of France and the Battle of Britain, the Roosevelt administration began providing aid to allied nations like Britain, e.g., the Lend-Lease Act, 1941, and ramped up defense production, becoming the arsenal of democracy. Pearl Harbor and U.S. entry. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on a U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack caused significant American casualties and propelled the U.S. fully into World War II. The next day, the U.S. declared war on Japan. A few days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S. America fought on 2 major fronts, Europe and the Pacific. Home front mobilization. During World War II, the U.S. undertook an unprecedented national mobilization. Industrial production shifted to war materials, and government control over the economy increased. Millions of men enlisted, while women entered factories and various professions in large numbers. Rosie the Riveter became an icon, contributing significantly to the war effort. African Americans also served in the military and worked in war industries, but still faced segregation and discrimination, e.g., the Tuskegee Airmen. Fearing espionage, the government forcibly relocated about 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of whom were U.S. citizens, to inland internment camps, a dark chapter of wartime civil liberties violations. Major campaigns and victory. In the Pacific Theater, after a decisive turning point victory at the Battle of Midway, 1942, U.S. forces employed an island-hopping strategy, gradually advancing toward Japan through brutal battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. In the European theater, U.S. forces fought alongside allies, primarily Britain and the Soviet Union. Allied forces landed in North Africa in late 1942 and Italy in 1943. On June 6, 1944, the Allies successfully executed the massive D-Day landings in Normandy, opening a second front in Europe. Germany finally surrendered in May 1945. Atomic bombs and war's end, to compel Japan's swift surrender and avoid the potentially immense casualties of invading the Japanese mainland. President Harry S. Truman, 1945 to 1953, who succeeded FDR upon his death, authorized the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima. August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki, August 9, 1945. This remains the only use of nuclear weapons in warfare. The immense destruction and casualties prompted Japan to announce its unconditional surrender on August 15th, officially ending World War II. Post-war order and the Cold War's beginning. World War II fundamentally reshaped the global landscape. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the world's two dominant superpowers. However, their fundamental ideological conflict, capitalist democracy versus communist totalitarianism, and geopolitical rivalry quickly turned former allies into adversaries. In 1946, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill delivered his Iron Curtain speech, vividly describing the division of Europe into Eastern and Western blocs. The U.S. adopted a strategy of containment to prevent the spread of Soviet communism. Key initiatives included Truman Doctrine, 1947 pledged economic and military aid to nations threatened by communism, initially Greece and Turkey. Marshall Plan, 1948 provided massive economic assistance to help Western European nations rebuild after the war, stabilize their societies, and resist communist influence. Berlin Airlift, 1948 to 1949 after the Soviets blockaded West Berlin. The U.S., UK, and Allies supplied the city's population entirely by air, forcing the Soviets to lift the blockade. North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, 1949, a military alliance formed by the U.S. and Western European nations for collective defense against potential Soviet aggression. The Soviet Union responded by forming the Warsaw Pact in 1955. Cold War goes global and domestic impact. The Cold War quickly spread beyond Europe. In 1949, the Communist Party won the Chinese Civil War, establishing the People's Republic of China, seen by the U.S. as a major gain for the Communist bloc. From 1950 to 1953, the U.S. led a United Nations coalition intervening in the Korean War, fighting against North Korean and Chinese forces, ending in an armistice that left the Korean peninsula divided to this day. The Cold War also fueled intense anti-communist sentiment and a Red Scare within the U.S. Senator Joseph McCarthy exploited these fears, launching McCarthyism, making unsubstantiated accusations of communist infiltration against government officials, intellectuals, and artists, leading to many ruined careers and suppressing dissent. The nuclear arms race escalated, with both the U.S. and USSR developing hydrogen bombs, casting a shadow of potential nuclear annihilation over humanity. Prosperity, civil rights, and turbulent times, 1950s to 1970s. Post-war prosperity and suburbanization. The 1950s marked a period of sustained economic prosperity in the U.S. The middle class expanded and the baby boom generation was born. Supported by policies like the GI Bill, many veterans accessed education and home loans, fueling mass suburbanization. The suburban lifestyle, characterized by single-family homes, automobiles, and highways, became emblematic of the American dream. Television became widespread, and consumerism flourished. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, 1953 to 1961, oversaw the massive interstate highway system project. The Civil Rights Movement. Despite economic prosperity, racial segregation and discrimination remained severe, especially in the South. African Americans launched the Civil Rights Movement to fight for equal rights. Key events and milestones included Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. 1954, the Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, overturning the separate but equal doctrine. Montgomery bus boycott. 1955 to 1956, after Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white man, Martin Luther King Jr. led a year-long boycott that resulted in a Supreme Court ruling declaring bus segregation unconstitutional. King's advocacy of nonviolent resistance made him the movement's iconic leader. Sit-ins, freedom rides, marches. Civil rights activists used various nonviolent tactics to challenge segregation in the South, often facing violent opposition. March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. 1963, over 200,000 people gathered in Washington, D.C., where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Civil Rights Act of 1964, signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson, LBJ, 1963 to 1969. This landmark legislation outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in public accommodations, employment, and federally funded programs. Voting Rights Act of 1965 prohibited discriminatory voting practices like literacy tests and authorized federal oversight of elections, dramatically increasing black voter registration and participation in the South. The civil rights movement achieved monumental victories, but racism persisted. Later movements like Black Power expressed more militant demands. Other minority groups, Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and women were inspired by the civil rights movement to launch their own struggles for equality. Johnson's Great Society. Alongside civil rights legislation, President Johnson launched the Great Society, programs aimed at eliminating poverty and improving education, healthcare, and urban environments. Initiatives included Medicare, health insurance for the elderly, and Medicaid for the poor, education aid, and environmental protection measures. These programs further expanded the federal government's social welfare role. The Vietnam War. In the context of the Cold War, the U.S. gradually deepened its involvement in Vietnam, supporting South Vietnam against the Communist North. Under the Johnson administration, the U.S. massively escalated its military presence, becoming fully embroiled in the Vietnam War. The war proved costly in lives. Over 58,000 American deaths, and resources became deeply unpopular at home and offered no clear path to victory. Television brought the war's brutality into American living rooms for the first time, fueling a massive anti-war movement. Society became severely divided over the war. In 1968, the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy exacerbated domestic turmoil. The Nixon era and Watergate. President Richard Nixon, 1969 to 1974, pursued a policy of détente, improving relations with the Soviet Union and China. His historic visit to China in 1972 opened relations. He also gradually withdrew U.S. troops from Vietnam. Paris Peace Accord signed in 1973. South Vietnam fell to the north in 1975. Domestically, he established the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. However, the Watergate scandal, stemming from a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate complex during the 1972 election campaign and the subsequent cover-up by the Nixon administration, led to impeachment proceedings. Facing certain impeachment, Nixon resigned in August 1974, the only U.S. president ever to do so. Watergate severely damaged public trust in government. Conservative resurgence, Cold War's end, and new century challenges. Late 1970s, present. Economic stagflation and conservative ascendancy. The 1970s saw the U.S. economy struggle with stagflation, high inflation, and high unemployment simultaneously. Coupled with foreign policy setbacks like the Iran hostage crisis, 1979 to 1981, public disillusionment with liberal policies and government intervention grew. A conservative movement represented by figures like Ronald Reagan, 1981 to 1989, gained prominence. The Reagan administration implemented policies of tax cuts, deregulation, reduced social spending, and increased defense spending Reaganomics, while taking a hard line against the Soviet Union. End of the Cold War. Reagan's assertive policies in the arms race, combined with the Soviet Union's internal economic difficulties and reform efforts, Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost, led to a thaw and ultimately the end of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. The end of the Cold War marked the demise of the bipolar world order, leaving the United States as the world's sole superpower. Gulf War and 1990s prosperity. Under President George H.W. Bush, 1989 to 1993, the U.S. led a multinational coalition in the Gulf War, 1991, to expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait. During President Bill Clinton's administration, 1993 to 2001, the U.S. experienced a long period of economic prosperity, fueled by the information technology revolution, the rise of the internet. The Clinton administration achieved budget surpluses and championed the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. However, Clinton also faced impeachment, though acquitted by the Senate, over his affair with White House intern Monica Lewinsky. 9/11 attacks and the War on Terror. On September 11, 2001, al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked airplanes and crashed them into the World Trade Center towers in New York City and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., killing nearly 3,000 people. These attacks, 9/11, profoundly changed the United States. President George W. Bush, 2001 to 2009, declared a global war on terror. The U.S. invaded Afghanistan in 2001, overthrowing the Taliban regime that harbored al-Qaeda, though the conflict continued for many years. In 2003, citing concerns about Iraq possessing weapons of mass destruction, intelligence later proven faulty, and supporting terrorism, the U.S. bypassed UN Security Council authorization and launched the Iraq War, overthrowing Saddam Hussein's regime. Both wars were immensely costly in lives and resources and triggered long-term instability and controversy in the Middle East. Domestically, the Patriot Act expanded government surveillance powers, sparking debates about civil liberties versus national security. The Department of Homeland Security was created. Obama era and financial crisis. In 2008, a severe financial crisis erupted in the U.S., triggered by the subprime mortgage crisis, with global repercussions. That same year, Barack Obama, 2009 to 2017, was elected as the first African-American president in U.S. history. The Obama administration implemented economic stimulus measures to combat the crisis and passed the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, ACA, often called Obamacare, to expand health insurance coverage. In foreign policy, Obama ended the war in Iraq, authorized the operation that killed Osama bin Laden, and emphasized multilateral cooperation. The Trump era and political polarization. In 2016, Republican candidate and businessman Donald Trump, 2017 to 2021, won the presidency on an America First platform. The Trump administration pursued policies including tax cuts, deregulation, appointing conservative judges, and building a wall on the U.S.-Mexico border. In foreign policy, he questioned traditional alliances, withdrew from international agreements like the Paris Climate Accord and the Iran nuclear deal, and initiated a trade war with China. Trump's governing style and policies exacerbated political polarization and division within American society. In 2020, amidst the global COVID-19 pandemic and protests against racial injustice, sparked by the murder of George Floyd, Democrat Joe Biden, 2021 president, won the presidential election. On January 6, 2021, some Trump supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol building in an attempt to stop the certification of the election results, an event that shocked the nation. Contemporary challenges. Entering the third decade of the 21st century, the United States faces numerous complex challenges: persistent political polarization and social division, economic inequality, racial tensions, the threat of climate change, responding to global pandemics, strategic competition with major powers like China, maintaining the health of democratic institutions, and adapting to the impacts of rapid technological change, such as artificial intelligence. The story of America is a history full of dynamism, creativity, conflict, and constant change. From the earliest indigenous societies to the founding of colonies, the victory of the Revolutionary War, and the crafting of the Constitution, from the ambition and costs of westward expansion to the tearing apart and reunification of the Civil War, from the wave of industrialization to the trials of 2 world wars and the standoff of the Cold War, through the cries of the Civil Rights Movement, the shifts in social culture, and up to the myriad challenges faced today. This nation has perpetually oscillated between its ideals and realities, unity and division, progress and setbacks. It has profoundly shaped the world and continues to be shaped by it. Its future will continue to be written by the people of this land, navigating the legacy of history and the choices of the present. Conclusion. Thank you for listening to this long and complex journey through American history. From the primordial wilderness to the superpower of today, we have witnessed the struggles, sacrifices, triumphs, and tribulations on this land. The wheels of history keep turning, and America's story continues. If you are interested in exploring more historical details, personal stories, or in-depth analysis, please subscribe to our channel. Join us as we continue to delve into the past, understand the present, and contemplate the future. We look forward to meeting you again on our next historical journey.